And hello, everyone, and happy Tuesday afternoon to you. Welcome back to Two Guys in the Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And over here on the other side of me, back from Ghana again, is William Bell from All Things Fulfilled. William, welcome back again.
Thank you, Don. It's good to be back.
I know you're worn smooth out and you got a little bit of a cold. So we'll try to make it through this hour and hopefully contribute something to everyone that will be of benefit to them. Um, any news that you want to share with us, William, about what's going on in your world?
Uh, no, not much going on. I'm just trying to be here as much as I possibly can today. And that may be a little difficult, but other than that, I'm good and just thankful to be here. Glad all the flights went well, etc. And really
I am
glad to be.
always thankful for uneventful flights.
Yeah.
I was watching a YouTube video. I don't even know what flight it was, where it was to. I don't know anything about it. But some old boy stood up in the aisle with some kind of a deodorant spray,
Mm.
not truly a deodorant, but just started spraying it all throughout the cabin. And it was evidently a pretty repugnant smell. And they tried to get him to sit down, and he was just belligerent and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, boy, you're just hearing and seeing so much of this crazy actions by passengers. It's just like, dude, you're 35,000 feet up in the air. You don't want to be messing around.
Hmm.
You know,
That
you
would
don't.
have that would have drove me crazy.
Oh yeah,
To have somebody spray something. I already have problems, with my sensitivity to
yeah,
things like that.
yeah. You might have put your boxing training into practice. Okay. Well, William, last week, Larry did a great job as usual filling in for you, and we continued our discussion, of the Abrahamic promise and the Abrahamic promise as it relates to eschatology. You and I have been discussing how in in the arena of eschatology, those of us who are preterists, very commonly and rightly so, but we emphasize that eschatology is Israel centric as presented in the New Testament. It's certainly not Israel only by any stretch of the imagination, but it is nonetheless Israel centric. But what I have been guilty of over the years is not emphasizing enough how Israel's eschatology is Abrahamic eschatology, which in turn was Adamic eschatology. And so we've been developing that from Romans chapter 4. And so I want us to return there and to pick up where we left off week before last, because Larry and I, even though we continued discussing the Abrahamic eschatology, we went to Galatians a good bit. But back here in Romans chapter 4, he begins to talk about Abraham's justification by faith, Abraham's choosing by God, why he was chosen, and why he was given the promise of the inheritance. And we pick up then in Romans chapter 4, and we just start with verse 9. Does this blessedness, and he's just quoted from Psalms 132, where David said, blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute unrighteousness or impute sin. Blessed is the man whose sins are covered. And so he poses this question: does this blessedness of righteousness and forgiveness come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised, while he was uncircumcised? Now, this kind of a question was going to strike at the very heart of Judaism's attitude and self identification. because as scholar after scholar after scholar after scholar, Jewish, non-Jewish, et cetera, has pointed out, Israel had certain markers, identifying markers. Sabbath was one of them. Circumcision was one of them. The feast days were one of them. So, William, here, Paul strikes at the very foundation, as it were, of Israel's identity by asking, okay, then where did the blessedness of forgiveness come? Does it come through circumcision or uncircumcision? Develop that for us just a little bit about how that would have shaken the Jewish reader of what Paul was saying.
Well, certainly, with those who were Israel only in their thinking, um, it would have had catastrophic, reverberations throughout their understanding for him to develop the fact that the righteousness of God came to Abraham while he was yet uncircumcised, and therefore laying the groundwork that it was not for Israel only, but it was for those who were not, as we would consider, of the circumcision, and that's extremely powerful to consider from that perspective, and shows that there's a broader scope to the promise of Abraham, and carrying it all the way back to Adam, as you indicated before, and as we discussed. So it's something that is greater than that, and greater than just trying to limit it, to that one particular aspect, or to Israel from that perspective. So that's really critical. That's very important. You said that it was a while before you started making that connection. That was one of the things that I think all the way back when we were doing the lectures with Max. And on one of those lectures, I had to teach on Galatians chapter 4, I think, or the book of Galatians. I can't remember. I think it was the book of Galatians. And at that time, I was saying to myself, I said, where is there anything about eschatology in Galatians? Because I hadn't really looked at it that much. And it wasn't, as people are focused on time statements and things of that nature, you tend to look for some of that. And it didn't appear to be much, excuse me, if any at all, of that in Galatians. But once I started studying the context and looking at what was said, and particularly with the inheritance, as you've spoken before, then it just hit like a hammer. We're dealing with the inheritance. We're dealing with the very end game and end goal of eschatology, and therefore Galatians is very eschatological in the total parameters. And because of that, I wrote the little book, Eschatology in Galatians, and emphasize through the promise of Abraham, and that these things came about. And that's like the backdrop of the story of the New Testament, is this contesting over the inheritance by the sons of the flesh versus the sons of the spirit. And what's interesting is, even to this day, you have people claiming there is no such thing as sons of the spirit, as opposed to sons of the flesh. And again, that becomes a real interesting paradigm for some people to hold. But that's what I see being set up in Romans chapter 4, is the establishing of that concept of righteousness that came to Abraham while he was yet in uncircumcision.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly relevant to this whole issue of, quote, Israel only, because they say, well, when Paul talks about the uncircumcised receiving the blessings of faith, et cetera, they say, well, those are non-Torah observant Jews. Well, that's certainly not the case with Abraham. He was not a non-Torah observant Jew.
Yeah.
He was simply uncircumcised. Not only that, Noah was a uncircumcised, non-Torah observant individual, but he was a man of faith.
Yes.
And so that whole argument about i.e. the Gentiles or the uncircumcised being non-Torah observant Israelites just goes up in smoke when you consider the narrative from Adam all the way up to Abraham, that it was all based upon faith. That's Paul's whole point
Hmm.
right here. It was not it was not lineage oriented. It was basically faith oriented. And that just becomes so powerful all the way through. I mean, when you start talking about, for instance, the story of Ruth, for crying out loud, she was a Moabitess. And as a Moabite, I was reading an archaeological article just this last week. I don't even know where I put it now, but it was talking about the background history of the civilization, the culture of the Moabites, from which Ruth came. That was her roots. Obviously, having nothing whatsoever to do with non Torah observant Israelites.
Hmm.
But in talking about the Moabites, this particular article was talking about how absolutely ruthless, how bloodthirsty, how ungodly the Moabites were. Now, we sometimes read about the Assyrians and how cruel and what have you they were, and there's no doubt about that whatsoever. But the Moabites, just like so many of the ancient Near Eastern people, they delighted in cruelty. They delighted in spilling blood. They delighted in warfare. And so, again, to consider the story of Ruth, that here this woman is who made the famous story, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. That was an incredible statement of faith that had nothing whatsoever to do with bloodline and what have you. So anyway, this this comment about Abraham being justified by faith without circumcision, when you consider, pardon me, when you consider how the Jews viewed circumcision, this was an earth-shattering comment to any Jew would have heard or who would have read Paul's statement. Because after all, Genesis chapter 17, 12 and following, and Genesis chapter 12, chapter 17 particularly, circumcision, physical circumcision, was the sign of God's covenant with Abraham and his seed. And so for Paul to come along and to say the blessing of faith and the blessing of Abraham would not come through circumcision, but through faith. I mean, that's absolutely stunning. You know, William, I've said this on many occasions. You've heard me say it in lectures, and I've said it right here on our program at different times. Both in the Old Testament and the Tanakh, in Jesus and in the New Testament writers, we find statements that it's difficult for you and me, as living in a modern Western oriented world, so far removed from that culture, from that time. But they made statements that were so shocking, so fundamentally revolutionary in what they were saying when we understand that culture. And yet again, because we're so far removed, we don't catch the power of it. Well, they understood and they believed that circumcision was the very foundation of their relationship with Abraham. And in a sense, it was, but not in the ultimate sense. It tied them physically to him,
Hmm.
but it did not tie them spiritually to him. And it was the spiritual aspect of that covenant that that was the real heart and the core of the promise. You know, God in Deuteronomy chapter 30 called on Israel, circumcise your hearts, put away the sin from yourselves. Well, here strikes at the very one of the keys, I should say, of Romans chapter 4. Abraham was circumcised in heart before he was ever circumcised in flesh. Is that accurate to say?
Yes. Yes, most definitely.
So, what did that circumcised of heart mean? It meant he had an obedient heart. He had a dedication of heart that caused his physical life to follow the pattern. And so when we get into what he's about to say here, it explains the dichotomy. William, you and I, most of our ministerial life, have encountered and been involved in countless discussions with people when Paul says that the promise was not made based on works, based on obedience, but upon faith. And people say, see, the only thing that matters is faith. Faith alone is what saves. But is that Paul's point in Romans chapter 4?
No, no, it's not his point that it's just faith alone, because of course he establishes the fact that Abraham believed God, it was accounted to him for righteousness, but this belief in God was focused on the things that Abraham did in response to what God had required of him. And that's how his faith was made perfect, in terms of God telling him, get out of this country and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. And of course, Abraham did that, which was a tremendous demonstration of faith. A lot of people won't even sometimes leave their homes, let alone leave their cities and towns.
They won't get out of
Or
their home to go to worship service.
absolutely, absolutely. And then you talk about get out of your country and go to another place where the whole culture and everything is different. They're enemies, and you just don't understand how to associate with them. And so for him to do that was a tremendous display of faith on the part of Abraham, along with the other things that he did afterwards that God had required of him. So those are the things that establish the faith of Abraham, and not simply that he believed without any undergirding of activity or behavior in response to a divine requirement.
I'm reminded of what happened in Genesis chapter 21 as the Lord told Abraham, you take Isaac up on the mountain, and there you're going to sacrifice him. And Abraham never questioned. Now, Paul in Romans chapter 4 will refer back to that, and that's that whole situation, the story of Abraham and Isaac and the mountain and the sacrifice. Among the Hebrew scholars was called the Akedah. That was their Hebrew name for it. But Abraham believed that God was able to receive, or Abraham was able to receive Isaac back from the dead, even if the Lord allowed him to kill him, because he trusted that much. And boy, you talk about the demonstration of that faith, getting out of your country, going somewhere you never been before, where there's strange people, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is the ultimate test. But there are a couple of times in the Genesis 21 narrative, and you can go all the way back to Genesis chapter 15 as well. But as Abraham was ready to kill his only son, and God prevented it, the Lord made an incredible statement. Now, we look at this statement in light of the omniscience of God, the all-knowingness of God. But when he stayed Abraham's hand, kept him from killing Isaac, the Lord said in Genesis chapter 21, now I know that you believe. What? you know, well, Lord, I just left my homeland. That didn't count for anything. I've been traveling hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. I don't even know where I'm going. That doesn't count for anything. Well, it did through faith. But the whole point of it was that God was putting him to the ultimate test, trial of that faith. And that statement, now I know that you believe, to me is an incredible, incredible statement. And we find statements like this in Deuteronomy chapter 11, for instance, in which the Lord said he gave the law to Israel for them to keep it to show that they believed. And so there's this interplay, there is this interconnectedness between faith and obedience. Obedience alone, mechanical actions of obedience, is not faithful obedience. It is not faithful obedience. Yet obedience that sprang from faith in Abraham's example here, that faithful obedience resulted in that justification. You know, I'm reminded of Paul in Romans chapter 6, verse 17. God be thanked that you were the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart. There's that obedience of faith. You have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered to you, being then made free from sin. So when they, in full trust, in full compliance to the very best as human beings that they could, when they did what the Lord commanded, they were not earning their salvation. They were not saying, Lord, okay, look at me, I'm good enough. But when they trusted God, that's when that obedience joined with their faith to produce that life. Is that an accurate depiction of what Paul's saying?
Yes, it is, and that carries through the entirety of Hebrews chapter 11. As you look at each of those statements, he will say, by faith, this happened. By faith, Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. There's always this verb of doing
Mm-hmm.
that undergirds the faith statement that's being made. He's talked about Noah in the same way. By faith, Noah built an ark, and so he prepared the ark, and through that obtained the righteousness which is through faith. And that's quite a lot of doing to build that ark. Excuse me. In response to what God said, along with the statement we've talked about before, Abraham and his family going out and from the land that they were in, all the way through uh, the history and of Hebrews chapter 11. So it's just remarkable to look over and over and over again at all those by faith statements, which are undergirded. And the one in verses 17 through 19 that you alluded to earlier when you talked about God, Abraham believed that God raised Isaac from the dead. And that's the way I teach it. I teach he believed that, and God did in fact do it as far as Abraham's faith was concerned. Because it says by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. Uh, Everything within him in terms of slaying Isaac, of killing him, of offering him up, Abraham did. It was God who actually intervened to prevent the actual act from taking place. But as far as Abraham's heart was concerned, that is precisely what he did. And because he did, and because he was in the act of doing it, it's saying that God raised him from the dead, which he did in a figurative sense. So, I mean, it's a very powerful statement of his faith from that perspective.
I stand amazed, and we used a little bit of levity there a few moments ago, but it's actually true of how superficial. And I'm not trying to be judgmental or harsh or anything like that or unkind, but it really is amazing how artificial and how superficial, perhaps I should say more accurately, the faith of so many Christians today truly is. I mean, at the slightest whim, at the slightest difficulty in their Christian life, they just walk away,
Mm.
you know? And heaven forbid that they actually be persecuted for what they believe. I mean, I'm not going to call any names here, but a minister that I've known for years and years. The last time I saw him, he said he didn't want to be seen talking to me. He
Mm.
refused to shake my hand because he didn't want anyone to think that he might possibly agree with me. So when I extended my hand, he wouldn't even shake my hand. And he, like I said, he just literally said, Don, I'm sorry, but I don't want to be seen talking to you.
Kind of like the Keith Mosier effect that over at the School
Oh
of Preaching.
yeah, that was
Hey, look,
precious.
look, I saw I saw his picture pop up on, how those images pop up and say this might be your friend.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
when I saw his picture up there, I just happened to click on it. And would you believe what it said? It said the number one persecutor at the Memphis School of Preaching. I said they got
Yeah.
that right. They
They
got
got
that right.
that one right. Boy,
Yeah. So
that
if it
that
ever
is,
pops up, click on the picture and just read the caption of it and see what it says.
yeah. Folks, there's such a story behind what William was alluding to. He and I went over to the Memphis School of Preaching one day. I was over there visiting, and
That was during my debate with Wiggins, wasn't
oh,
it?
that I believe you're right. I believe you're
Yes,
right.
yes,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
we went over there to get some material. I think
yes,
a book by her and on the Sabbath or something like that that he had
yeah.
done.
So we go in, and there's some of these students, shaking William's hand, and a few of them shaking my hand, and what have you. And you can pick it up from there, William, and you finish the story because it was just awesome.
Yeah, well, anyway, we were in the hallway and there was this fellow. He's a black fellow. He came over and seemed to be very enthusiastic about meeting me and everything. And so he shook my hand,
Yeah,
and I thought, great. I said, wow, what kind of reception is this I'm getting at
yeah.
my old alma mater, right? The people who chased me out. And then and he might have spoken to you as well. And
He
then
did. He did.
at about that time, Keith Mosher walked up, and he and I extended my hand to shake his hand, and I spoke to him, et cetera. He says something to the effect of, why would I want to shake your hand? And we don't agree on the same thing. We don't believe the same thing. Then he turned right around and he shook your hand and
Said,
called
"Hello,
you brother.
brother.
Yeah,
How you
called you
doing,
brother.
brother?"
And Don responds back with this quick wit. He said, well, I believe the same thing he does. It was so
Well, and,
funny.
and first of all, I said, "Oh, you're calling me brother? I
Yeah,
agree with
yeah,
him."
yeah.
Yeah. But there was one
That
of
was
the
funny. And then there was one other thing that happened. The
yeah,
guy who had earlier shook my hand came back and started dusting his
yeah.
hand off as if he was going to undo the shake. And he said, I take that handshake back.
I was standing there just beside myself. I got
Yeah,
to
it
tell
was
you,
crazy. It was
it, it
crazy.
it it really honestly was. But things happen, and so here was a young man that didn't want to be seen shaking your hand or mine. Mosier didn't want to shake your hand, and he wanted to take it back after shaking my hand,
Yeah.
obviously, and what have you. But listen, this minister that I mentioned a moment ago, that I've known for years and years, and the last time I saw him, he refused to shake my hand. He told me on the phone. He said because I was trying to get him to answer some questions in First Corinthians chapter 15, and he
Hmm.
said, "Look, Don, I really don't want to discuss this with you because I'm not so sure that I disagree with you on First Corinthians 15." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." And he said, "But I tell you what, I wouldn't defend it to save my life." And he said, "Furthermore, I'm not so sure that I disagree with you on 80/70." But he said, "I'm not going to teach it because I'm not going to get fired like you were." And, you can't help but think of Mark chapter 4 and the seed that is sown, and persecution comes, and the seed dies off. And so Jesus said that would happen. That has happened. That continues to happen. I can't tell you the number of people that have contacted me, all excited about what they're learning, all excited about the reality of fulfilled eschatology. And then somebody tells them, well, that's that heretical Max King doctrine. And I've had them call me up. Well, you were deceiving me, and my elders are calling me in and they're doing this and that and the other. I said, I never deceived you one thing. I said, you were reading the scriptures on your own. You were following the scriptures. You came to your own conclusions. And now when persecution arises, you don't even want to talk to me. I said, why are you calling me up on the phone? Well, that just lets you know that I don't believe in you anymore. Just
Well, it's
whatever.
interesting that you talk about that because as I was flying home, in that great expanse over the Atlantic Ocean, I thought about, what had transpired and the contributions that both of us have made to eschatology. And, I hear people all the time saying, okay, well, Don is the greatest mind in eschatology, and who's going to follow him up in his legacy on that? He's the greatest one. And I got to thinking about that, and I said, okay, um, why does he need anybody to do that? Because of what has been done. And I remember the night that we were standing out in front of the restaurant. I don't know what was the name of it in I can't think of the name of it. It was in Ardmore, when you made that statement that you were going to do your very best to be the very best at what you were doing, and I really admired it. I thought it was a great statement, and you follow through. And that's what I've seen you do over the years. And then I see these guys come around, and it's like they have to try to take that from you in some way. Everything that you've done, they come up and they've been around for a few years, or some of them not that long, but seem like it's the first thing that they want to do is to try to destroy your character, try to, demonstrate that you're not as wise, intelligent, and studied as you are, and feel like they can just come up with anything and kind of bump you off, so to speak, and then leave eschatology without anybody to defend it along the way. And I thought about that, and I said, well, Dunn's legacy is done. He's already established what he needs to do. And then when you look at all of the guys coming along and they're worrying about what's going to happen to eschatology, I'm seeing guys pop up all over the place that have studied and are doing extremely well. I
Amen.
listened to one again while I was in Africa, and I was really impressed with what he had done and what he said and the way they presented themselves. And he was a guy I hadn't listened to before, but I thought, we don't have anything to worry about as far as eschatology is concerned. And so I thought about it. I said, well, what did you do, in terms of myself? And I thought about it from this perspective. When I learned about eschatology, I wasn't looking for it. Okay. Eschatology found me from that perspective. I was just reading the scripture, and all of a sudden, Luke 21 jumped out at me, and I said, well, hey, I got to do something about this. I can't just ignore this, and when I saw it, I said, almost immediately, my whole paradigm in eschatology changed. And now I said, now let me go back and see if I can support what this premise says in Luke 21:20 through 22. And as I began relooking at the scriptures, I knew they couldn't be interpreted from a physical point of view because that just wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, well, what did I do? I didn't know anybody at the time. I started after a while being accused of following Max King. I didn't know who he was. And I said, well, let me see if I can contact him. And because I wanted to know if, was there anybody else in the Church of Christ who believed this? Well, I went to Harding, as I've told this story before. I went to Harding, asked if he had written a book, and lo and behold, he had. It was the Spirit of Prophecy,
Right.
two hardcover books that they had under the bookshelf, as if they were trying to hide them. Had dust. When the guy picked them up, he was blowing the dust off the cover at the time. And I said, I'll take both of them. So I took them, and I still have one copy. I gave one copy to a friend of mine. And so at that point, nobody in the city believed this. There was no one. I was like about 24, maybe 25 years old, just 25 years of age. A kid against the whole city, against all the school of preaching, which had influence with all the churches, et cetera. They could call the church and say, fire him, and they would
That's
do
right.
it.
That's right.
And so what did I do? I just simply took a stand. That was it. I took a stand. And from that stand, I met Max King. Then the Living Presence, lectures started. The annual eschatology seminar started. Then I met a guy named Dunn Preston because I had written a paper. And with that paper, it was passed through a mutual friend of ours who said something similar to what you were just relating. Well, I'm
Yep.
not going to teach it because I'll get fired and lose my retirement.
Yep.
And because of that, I met Dunn. You came to the seminar the first year, and you sat there, and not exactly, but that's the idea, of what's going on through your mind. And you said, well, next year I'm going to speak. And there you were. And then through you, here comes Jack Scott. And then through Jack Scott, here comes Larry Siegel and some of the rest, and down the road. So the biggest thing I could say is, I may never get credit for anything else, but I took a stand that had a domino effect of meeting some of the greatest minds, some of the greatest contributors to eschatology, and linking up with Max King, of all people in the world. How did that happen?
Mm.
And so there it is. So, I don't need any other credit other than the fact that I took a stand. And because of that, too, I've seen young people come along, who were persecuted and who were in some way discouraged, wanting to give up. and some of them may have temporarily given up. And I was there to try to help them, encourage them because of everything that I had gone through. And I didn't want them to be, I always tell them Max was like Job's comforters. They were called miserable. And I mean that in a very loving way.
Yeah.
But, I had just gotten fired. They withdrawn from me and everything. And I called up Max and he said, "Oh, you get over
Yep.
it." that's, that's the way he said it. And I
Yep,
thought,
don't worry
well,
about it. Yep, yep,
is
yep.
this all I get?
Yeah.
But that's all I got.
That's all you
But
got.
I
Yeah.
tried to make it a point that I would never, allow anybody to go through that if I could without me trying to give them some kind of moral and, encouragement, et cetera. And I was there, even opened my house to some of them
Right.
to allow them to come in and stay with me while they were going through what they were going through. And so it's made a difference. And that's basically it. I just took a stand, and that stand has had an impact on a
Yes.
lot of people, whether or not people consider me this way or that way. But if I hadn't taken that stand, who knows what the situation might have been? I might not have ever met you, Max, or any of the rest, and that probably would have had a tremendous impact on, or negative impact on the
Negative
movement.
impact.
Yeah,
Well, I can tell you, and I appreciate your kind words. People do ask me all the time, well, who's going to, somebody posted on Facebook just the other day, who's going to take Don Preston's
yeah,
place? Well, I don't even look at it like that. That's insignificant to me. I'm very much with you, but I tell people all of the time that if I have a mentor, it's William Bell, because you mentioned that paper. A mutual friend of mine, I was struggling with some issues about eschatology, and this mutual friend said, "There's a guy in Memphis you need to talk to." And so I said, "Well, who is this guy?" And he told me your name, gave me your phone number. I made that phone call. Back that was in the days when phone charges were 35 or 40 cents a minute. you know.
I'm glad you had the money to pay for them.
I can tell you right now, I got chastised plenty by the bookkeeper in my family. You got to stop this. It's killing us. But I didn't stop it. And you were then, and I believe you are now, that you have been such a profound influence in my life. And I say all the time, there's not a time that goes by, not a lesson that you give that I do not glean something from it, that it doesn't challenge me and broaden my horizons. And people recognize, and if they don't recognize it, I tell them so, that in my estimation, you are absolutely one of the greatest minds on eschatology alive in the world today. I mean, I appreciate obviously people respecting the work that I do, but I I don't believe that I would be where I am, William, without your assistance, without your insights, because they have just been absolutely invaluable to me. And again, I tell people that all the time. You've heard me do it in public,
Yeah, yeah. And
you know.
thank you for that. And it's not like I'm looking for any of that,
Oh, I
but
know that, but
the way I view it is this: my aim, and I don't and our aim, I don't think, is to try to be the go all and know all of all
no,
of this,
no.
but it is to study and lay some foundations, which I think have been very well laid, that other people will come, just like you're saying that you did, and see those insights, and they don't have to go back and dig through a lot of the things.
Oh
They've got
yeah.
a broader foundation on which to live. I mean, if they could only imagine what we didn't have back in
Oh
the
boy.
day.
Oh
And
boy.
then they've got this just plethora of information out there and still growing
Oh
even
yeah.
now. And you got so many people now producing information. So they've got so many things to pursue, to expand upon, to study upon. And that's why you're seeing these individualized studies that are coming out from some of these people on various things that we didn't have time to develop individually. In some cases, you've had more, uh, but I didn't. But they still are able to do that and expand on something from an individual. They can chase that rabbit all the way from the hole to the whole 9 yards, and look at it and just give so much more to the subject than even some of the fundamental work that was done. And so I'm totally ecstatic about that. I take my hat off to these young guys. I
Oh,
feel very
absolutely.
confident that we don't have to worry about the work not being done or not getting done in the future. I mean, there's no way they can stop what has happened.
Well, and a prime example of that is what happened in Jonesboro, Arkansas last year with the conference that was there. I mean, when you've got people ridiculing the movement, Sam Frost is constantly saying, "Oh, preterism is dying out."
Mm.
You know, they're just people leaving by droves. Well, in the first place, I don't think he knows what he's talking about. Second place, I know he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's whistling past the graveyard. But when you have a conference of over 300 people plus, 300 plus, and people from literally everywhere. It's the largest, to my knowledge, the largest preterist conference that's ever been held. They had to turn people away because they didn't have enough seating.
Mm.
And so they're in tentative plans to hold another one. So you got these young guys that are coming up that are doing a fantastic job of their own research, that are beginning to do the writing. They're doing their podcast, and people are tuning into them. And it's like you say, you know, in many instances, William, they're building upon the foundation that you and I and Larry and others have indeed laid. There's no question that we've done a lot of quote foundation laying, and it's kind of amusing at times that you you read or you watch some blogs and you hear some of these younger fellas, and they're basically quoting from our work. You recognize the terminology that it comes from some of our work. Now, they're not giving accreditation, which I don't think is quite proper, but nonetheless, we don't have to have that. I'm not dependent on receiving praise from people, but you recognize that what they're doing is building on the foundation that we have laid. And they're laying their own building blocks on top of that. And it's so encouraging to read and to see that they're adding some really, really excellent additional insights
Hmm.
that we haven't even explored before. And you're going, holy cow, that's good. You know, I'm going to steal that, all of that kind of thing. So it has been and continues to be a tremendous journey. It is something that I'm like you. I was privileged to have you. I was privileged to have a little bit of a database that Max had done with Spirit of Prophecy, even though I'll be really honest, I haven't finished reading that book to this day. And I should, but I haven't. But the point of fact is, when Living Presence came out, there was a database, there was a foundation that we could read, that we could build on. Pardon me. And now all of that is out there. And what I did, I followed to a certain extent, to a great extent, like you. I simply took a stand because I came to believe, and I'm like you in this regard as well. I didn't set out to solve the problem of eschatology. I set out to solve my own ignorance in regard to things that were being taught that I was being conflicted about from the scriptures. It was like, wait a minute, here's what I've been taught, here's what the scriptures are saying. And so, like I said, like you, I just simply took a stand. And I never will forget, I used to tell Jan as we were dating that in the churches of Christ, all you have to do is show us if we're wrong, and we'll change. Because all we want in the churches of Christ is the truth. Well, after we were married, and I began to see all of these things conflicting with the traditional views, um, I would come home after studying and struggling all day long with my traditional views. And I'd lay the scriptures down and I said, read that and tell me what it says. And of course, she would just peg it because she didn't have all this baggage. She didn't have 5 generations of Church of Christ teaching or of all millennial. I tell people jokingly all the time, although it's true, her upbringing was Methabapticostal. And so
Mm.
she had an admixture of this and that, whatever else. Pardon me. She didn't know what she believed. So she was able to see what the scriptures were saying without any blinders on. And when she would tell me what it says, I was like, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. And she said, what's wrong? And I would tell her, babe, look, that's not what the churches of Christ teach. Well, you've always told me that if the Church of Christ is wrong, all that we have to do is show them where they're wrong and they'll change. I said, yeah, but I lied. They don't believe that. They don't believe that at all. And I said, if I teach that, if I preach that, we're going to get fired. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the only thing she ever responded to was, you have to teach what you believe to be the truth, but could you take a long time before you take a stand? And I would assure her, I'm not going to take a stand until I'm 100% convinced. Well, that's good. That's good. You know? But again, your story, my story, the story of Larry Siegel, the story of so many others, Jack Scott, these men took a stand. And if I could just give the analogy here with Abraham, I didn't know where I was going when I took a stand. I
I
had,
sure didn't know.
yeah, none of us knew where we were going at all. I didn't know how I was going to make the next paycheck. Now the congregation said, "Oh, Don, we'll keep paying you until you find another job." And I thought, you're going to be paying me the rest of my life then. And I even told one of the elders that said that to me, I said, you don't understand. You've blackballed me in the church. Nobody's going to hire me. So I said, how long are you going to keep paying me? Well, as long as need be. And I said, okay. Well, anyway, I won't go into the rest of it. But the point of fact is, and I certainly don't have the faith of Abraham. Now, I'm not saying I'm an Abraham. I'm simply saying that, like Abraham left a place of comfort, he left a place of home, left a place of security. You and others and I. That's all we did. We took a stand. We were willing to believe in the truth of God's word, willing to believe that God would provide. I believe in the providence of God with all of my heart. And it's never let me down, never has let me down. You know, David said, I have been young and now I'm old, and I have never seen the righteous hungry or begging for bread. Well, guess what? People have been ultra good to us down through the years, just like they have been to you. And that's called God's providence. Abraham did not know so much. God never sat down and said, okay, Abraham, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you out here and I'm going to show you a land that flows with milk and honey. And that's the land I'm going to give to you before I ever have you leave Ur of the Chaldees. So here's what you're going to get, Abraham. Do you think it's a good trade? No, no, no. He left a comfortable home for a place he had never been before, for a circumstance he had never been in before. Abraham took a stand. And I have had people contact me 2 or 3 times over the last few weeks asking, I'm attending a church that is certainly not preterist. I've been sharing with my elders. I've been sharing with some of the members. What do I do? Because I'm starting to get a lot of resistance. The elders are thinking about calling me in. And I haven't used the exact terminology of you just got to take a stand. I didn't use that specific terminology, but that was the message that I gave. And with 1 or 2 of them, I've expressed what we need in the movement of covenant eschatology is we need more warriors. We need men like Travis Drum, Zach Davis over there in Jonesboro, Arkansas, that I mentioned. We need more young men and others who are experienced, who are just now coming to this understanding and are coming to the courage to take their stand, to be like Abraham, and to be willing to do what God calls us to do. I mentioned a minister a little bit ago who wouldn't shake my hand. And on the phone, he told me he would not, he'd never teach it, he'd never preach it, he'd never defend it. And he told me on that phone that night, he said, well, I suspect, Don, pardon me, that I've lost a lot of respect in your eyes because of what I said. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yes. I said, because here's the deal. Pardon me. I know for a fact that you stand in the pulpit week after week after week and you tell people, buy the truth and do not sell it. You stand in the pulpit and you tell people you have to love the Lord your God more than your family, more than your job, more than security, more than comfort. You tell people they must be willing to make any sacrifice to know, to understand, and to obey the truth and to follow the truth no matter what. And I said, yet now, right here on the phone, you're telling me that you are not willing to do what you tell others to do. And I said, you know what, brother? There's a word for that. I'm not going to use it, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. So that was the end of that conversation, as you can well imagine.
Mm.
And to my knowledge, he continues, with the quote, comfortable position that he was in. So what we've talked about tonight with Abraham is a man who took a stand. And that stand demanded that he do certain things. There was a German philosopher slash theologian, uh, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was his name. I don't know if you've ever read any of his writings or not. Some of the most moving writing that he wrote in the midst of World War II, or as he saw World War II coming. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was ultimately arrested by the Nazis because he was in Germany. He was a theologian and he was taking a stand against the Nazis. Well, the Nazis wouldn't allow any dissent. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer said something like this: a faith that does not obey is not faith. Only faith that obeys is biblical faith. That's a profound statement because an awful lot of people in the theological world in which we live seem to think that as long as you have this mental assent that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that's as far as you need to go with it. That's not biblical faith. Throughout the book of John, we find that message, the message that Bonhoeffer iterated. If you believe, you obey. If you obey, you have believed, and that's just all there is to it. So I think that story of Abraham and his justification by faith, demonstrated through his obedience, gives us tremendous insight into the entire doctrine of justification by faith. But it also shows us, since the inheritance of Abraham, okay, that was to come in fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham, and that inheritance was, in you and your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. That was the promise to Abraham. It was also right here in Romans chapter 4 that he would inherit the world through his faith. Well, William, in what way, for crying out loud, in what way did Abraham inherit the quote world? That's the Greek word cosmos there.
Mm-hmm.
So how did Abraham inherit the world? Through his faith.
Well, he would inherit the world through his faith, through the world itself having faith in the same message and the same God that Abraham had faith in. And that's how he would inherit the world from that perspective. At least that's how I understand it.
Yeah, and I see that, which is what you were hinting at. I see here directly related to that seed.
Yes.
And you and your seed shall all the nations of the earth be
Hmm.
blessed. Well, guess what? When when any person, every person of faith of any nation exhibits the same kind of faith that Abraham did to take a stand, to believe in the promise, to believe in the Lord of promise, to believe in the Lord that was able to give Abraham his son back in a figure, but nonetheless to give him his son back, that person becomes like Abraham. And this is what we started out on 3 or 4 weeks ago. This is the reality that came into fruition at the end of the law of Moses. Look here at verse 13, ladies and gentlemen, Romans chapter 4, verse 13. The promise that he, that is Abraham, would be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed, and that word seed is singular, or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. If those things, excuse me, for if those who are of the law are the heirs, faith is made void and the promise is of no effect. Here's Paul. Now he's writing after he's already written the book of Galatians, but he's saying, folks, the Abrahamic covenant, the Abrahamic promise, the Abrahamic inheritance is not realized through keeping the law of Moses. It comes at the end of the law of Moses. And William, how profound are the implications of finally coming to understand that the Abrahamic promise of inheriting the world through faith would come at the end of the law of Moses, when all three futurist eschatologies say we're still looking for the Abrahamic new heaven and new earth, and yet the law of Moses has passed away.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. Not one jot or tittle would in any wise pass till all were fulfilled. And so to indicate in any way that any of the eschatological promises are yet to be fulfilled necessarily implies that the law of Moses is yet in effect. There's no way around that premise. And uh, that's something that they will have to deal with. They will have to deal with, okay, the law is still here because it was the law, the fulfillment of the law, that would bring about the promise in fulfillment of Abraham. And that is the new heavens and new earth. That's righteousness. That's the resurrection. All of it
It's just life.
results.
Yeah, it is life. If
Yes.
if a law could have been given that could give life, then verily righteousness, which is the promise made to Abraham, Abraham believed God and it was counted unto him for righteousness. So here is Paul saying, if a law could have been given that could have given life, then verily righteousness would have been through the law. But righteousness didn't come through the law, it came through faith, the faith of Abraham.
Mhm.
And so all of this is profoundly interwoven within itself. And it just really, really, really brings into sharp focus how important it is for understanding the significance of the end of the law. You know, William, I don't have to tell you at all. In the churches of Christ, one of the most foundational doctrines is, oh, the law passed away at the cross.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's nothing more fundamental in the churches of Christ, or even for that matter, in the broader amillennial world. And I should say, even in the postmillennial world, it's fundamental. And in the, even, believe it or not, even in the dispensational world, oh, the law of Moses passed away in the first century. So all three futurist views understand or believe, oh, yeah, the law of Moses passed away. Oh, but we're still waiting for the Abrahamic promise of the inheritance of the land, of eternal life, of resurrection life, et cetera, et cetera. That's, the end of the Christian age is not the time of the inheritance. And that's the whole point. All right. Any final thought, William? We're right here at the close.
I think that pretty much sums it up. If people would just take that into consideration of how the fulfillment The promise of Abraham comes at the end of the law, and the implication being if it does not, and if we're still in a state of futurism, then we got to still be in the state of the law of Moses. The Bible says the law was not of faith. And so if it's by faith, then it can't be of the law.
Amen. All right. Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, William and I are going to say good night. God bless.
Good night.
Good night, William.